Hi, my name is Sarah Imes, and I'm a draper in the costume shop at Brooklyn College in the Department of Theater. And today I would like to show you how I made a dress for a show we did about 2 years ago called Act a Lady. It was an 18th century gown, but a man had to wear it. And so here's the dress and the photo of the dress as it's done. And I'll show you the steps that I took to complete this dress. Just a couple of reminders again. As a draper, I take fabric that's inexpensive and I shape it on a body so that I can create a shape that covers the body, that fits well, but I can also use this shape to make alterations on it. Like if I want to have a giant neckline like this, or I want to have a cutout around the stomach. So I can take notes on the cheap fabric while I'm shaping it. Then I can take this fabric, take it apart, and then this shape that I know fits my mannequin, I'm going to transfer onto paper. And then I can use this pattern to draw the fabric on the good material, because that way I won't be making any mistakes and I already know that this shape fits. So let's go ahead and look at the steps. So the premise of the play Act a Lady is that an all-men's club in the 1920s, they put on their annual show. And this year, it's an 18th century play. And since there are no women in the club, these Midwestern men from the 1920s have to dress up as fancy aristocratic ladies from 18th century France. And the play also delves into issues of femininity and masculinity, as well as how theater transforms people. And here is a dress that I'm going to show you how I made. Usually I would use a male mannequin to drape this dress, since a man is going to be wearing it, kind of like this, except we have skinnier mannequins in that. But because we are doing distance learning, once again I'm going to be draping this dress on my half-scale mannequin, which you can see on the right. So the first thing the draper has to do is have an intense conversation with the costume designer about their sketch. What does the costume designer want to express with this design? Is it scary, or is it funny? Is it elegant? And also, what are those little dots there anyway? So before I do any kind of draping, it's a must to have a conversation with the costume designer. So the designer was very interested in exploring 1920s interpretations of 18th century fashions, since it takes place in the 1920s, but it's depicting 18th century drama. In the script, there's mention that a lot of money has been spent on the costumes, so these costumes needed to look great. The actors in these costumes needed to look a little bit goofy, because they're dressed as women, but still sophisticated, because they really take getting in touch with their feminine side very seriously. So there had to be some elegance as well. The character here, Miles, he was played by our graduate student Harrison Marks, and he plays his woman, Lady Romola. I think the plot of the play, within the play, was some sort of French melodrama, so I'm not really sure what the characters were, but the costume designer wanted something bright and loud, and I think she accomplished this very well with this design. So this big green dress consists of a bodice with an attached skirt that ends at like the knees, maybe a little bit below the knees. And it has swags, and it's edged in fake flowers, I think. As you can see by the back view, the flowers don't go all the way around. From my recall, there was actually just a big old scallop in the back. The flowers ended up being a really expensive part of this costume, as well as time-consuming to attach 500 flowers onto this dress. So we wanted to make this flower part detachable so that when the dress got dry cleaned, we could save money, because dry cleaners hate dry cleaning fake flowers. So that was another complicated twist to this dress. And the other detail on this dress is the treatment of the side seams on the skirt. You see all these tiny little gathers here. Let's see, they're pleats. But down here, where the swag ends up, it's flat. So I have to go from all this volume up here, which is pleated into place, to absolutely flat down here. So that's going to be very, very interesting to see how I can manage that. And then also the reason why the hands and lower arms are green is because the actor is wearing matching gloves to the dress. Here's a quick photo of the costume designer putting the flowers on the mesh panel for that dress. As you can see, she's looking pretty pleased to be doing that work. Now on to the designer's photo research for this costume. I had mentioned earlier that she was interested in giving these 18th century costumes a 1920s flavor, and the pleats and flower scallops that we saw on the sketch were definitely a part of that. So she found some pretty interesting silhouettes from the 1920s that match up with the wide skirts from the 18th century. They stick out, but mostly they stick out kind of on the hips, the upper hips. So we'll have to do some kind of adjustment for that to make it look more 18th century. Just a quick side note, most people think that the 1920s fashions were all flapper dresses. And definitely for the most part, the silhouette from this time was pretty narrow and it was pretty fluid. And the costume designer certainly used this sort of silhouette in her show, but she needed something wider for the green dress. But there were a lot of other fanciful silhouettes in the 1920s too. The costume designer started to focus on a 1920s design house called the Bouet Sur because they used a lot of flowers and swag hems and wide skirts. And I think she really hit the gold mine with this shape she was looking for with this fashion house. As you can see how the skirts are wide on the sides and really stick out. That one's a little bit extra, I guess. Also, the use of flowers on the dress is something that she was interested in. And I think that this is a very good research for her that she can use for her green dress. Now, on to the 18th century. This is where the costumes are actually based, as the play within a play in Act a Lady takes place in the 18th century, and the silhouettes and shapes of those dresses really need to be followed. So what we're looking at here, and this research was presented by the designer as well as her 1920s research, this is the quintessential silhouette of the late 18th century. You can see that on the wide skirt there are also pleats, similar to how the costume designer made her fanciful design, but there are fewer, and these ones are actually functional. They're here to create this shape. And this is such an unusual shape, isn't it? I mean, the bodice, it's so stiff, and there's no boobs. And then the skirt is so wide, but then when you look at it, it's actually quite narrow. So how on earth does this shape get created in the first place? And this is something as a draper I have to think about before I can even start draping the dress. Here is the same style of dress, but this time you can see it on an actual human in this portrait. And again, look how stiff the bodice is. I mean, she cannot bend over, and she can't really lower or raise her arms. They're kind of stuck the way they are there. And then that skirt, it's so wide and yet so narrow. And then you can see her little foot peeking out from down there. So she's not just floating on the carpet. Anyway, so this is kind of a contextual image of the research that the designer had provided. And here is the secret to creating the shape that we just saw. Let's see, we have the tight-fitting bodice on top. That's called a corset. It's very, very stiff, and it's traditionally stiffened with strips of whalebone, which were very strong but flexible. This prevented a woman from moving naturally and from lifting her arms anywhere. And the actors in Act a Lady, when they are in costume, they actually had to obey this acting style, and I think they were trained especially how to move. The lower part is the pannier, and so it's kind of a skirt that sticks out, and it's a framework to drape the costume on. Here are other images of panniers. And so the word pannier is French for breadbasket. And I guess if you think about it, when these panniers are attached to the body, they do look like breadbaskets hanging off of the figure. So that's one shape, is to have separate panniers attached to the bodice. And that developed into just creating a single skirt. And after that, you can also make a longer skirt. It just gets more and more involved. I think it's how heavy the skirt is and how much support you need. But for our purposes, I am going to continue with a shortened pannier like this. So I need to get a hold of a half-scale corset and a half-scale set of panniers in order for me to continue draping. You can get whole-scale panniers and corsets online. There are a lot of reenactment companies that make very nice muslin and cotton corsets and crinolines. And they also have a nice selection of contemporary sizes, like for plus-size people or for tall people. So that's a very good option to have when you're dealing with actual humans in a costume shop, not during social distancing. So the other alternative is to make a corset and to make some panniers. And this book is very, very popular with the costume business. It's called Corsets and Crinolines. It's pretty old now, but it gives you a pretty comprehensive look at the variety of corsets throughout the ages, as well as the different types of crinolines and panniers that have been used throughout the ages, and some nice instructions on how to draft the pattern. So I'm going to have to make something for my little half-size mannequin. Here's another close-up again of the front cover of Corsets and Crinolines, which is a very popular book in the costume business in constructing foundation garments for costumes. And so from this book, I located the 18th century corset pattern, and you can see it's kind of just a primitive graph of the basic shapes to use. And so I took these shapes and I applied them to my half-scale mannequin and created a pattern, and I drew out the pattern, and since I don't have a sewing machine at home, I had to sew all the channels by hand. So in these channels is going to go all the boning in order to make this bodice very stiff. And then here you can see it completed on the dress form. So now I have the understructure, at least the corset, in order to continue draping. It's always nice to have original illustrations from the period to kind of see how people felt about the foundation garments. And so here is an illustration called The Old Coquette. So she's got her panniers on and she has her corset on, and she kind of has a loose-fitting gown underneath it, which is basically her underwear. So this is the pattern for the panniers that I'm going to be using. And instead of doing an entire skirt, that's too much work, I'm just going to end it at the second row of boning here. So again, you can see here, this is to scale. So every 1/8 of an inch is 1 inch. So at a half scale, that means every 1/8 of an inch is a ½ inch. So using a lot of math, I had to create the pattern, which I drafted. And then I cut out the pieces and I sewed it together. And I made the panniers for the half-scale model. So now I have the foundation garments completed. And here's the corset that I built for a half-scale. I'm just going to place it on the mannequin now. It fits pretty good. And I have to close it up in the back. If this were a human, you could squeeze the human flesh and squish it and make it really tight. But this mannequin is made out of like sawdust and canvas, so you can't do a lot of squishing, which is also very good for actors because corsets, as uncomfortable as they look, are not actually meant to squish people. They're just supposed to cover the body and not allow them to move. So here's the corset. See the side view. The back I'll have to pin down. And then there's these little flaps here that help when you put additional skirts on top. So we have the corset here, and then here I have my panniers. And these usually lie slightly below the waist because you want your waist to be the tiniest point possible. So when you place the skirt, you want to have it just a tiny bit below the waist. And here are the panniers. And now we're ready to go.